We're on Daf Ayin Tes Amud Aleph, and we're about 1/3 of the way down. I think the easiest way to find it is if you count up from the wide lines. So you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4 lines up from the wide lines. The first word in the line is lun, and the first word in the line is mikoach, and at the end of that line, it's Chelev minolan. So let's just have a smooth takeoff. What we learned yesterday is that according to Rebby Yehoshua, im ein basar ein dam, he derives from a pasuk of ubsaro teachel, that you need to be able to have an achila on the basar in order for the dam to be meaningful. And we established that according to Rebby Yehoshua, if, let's say, the Eimurim, the Chalavim, and the Ivarim that have to be burnt on the Mizbeach became Tameh, then as long as the Basar Nechal, that Basar that's eaten to the Zichrei Kahuna, in the case of Kochim Kochim, or to Kohanim in the case of Kochim Kalim, have not contracted Tumah, they are still Tahorim, then that's enough. We don't need that both categories of Dam be Tahor. And we've derived the conclusion that from the pasuk it indicates if you have basar that can be eaten, then all systems go and you could be zarked down. But in the opposite case, where all the basar hanechal has contracted tumah, and that's an impossibility as far as achil is concerned, nevertheless, Rebby Yehoshua says you could be zarked down if the basar, the chelev that has to go on the mizbeach, is still in a state of tara, and we can now fulfill that achila through the what we call achilas mizbeach of the haktoras haimurim. So the Gemara says chelev minola. We don't have a source to prove that it's enough to have chelev that's tahar and is brought on the mizbeach, and for that matter, all you need is a kezayis of chelev. And even if all the rest of the basar is tameh, we can still be machsha the korban, and the dam is kosher for zrika. How do we know such a thing? What's the source from which we derive that conclusion? And the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Yishmael, Umoti ba. Others say it was Mishum Rabbi Yehoshua ben Chananya, the Amar Kra, and the Gemara now quotes a pasuk in Perek Yud Zayin of Sefer Vayikra in the context of Dam Shlomim, Zrikas Dam Shlomim, and it says the following. Now, the Gemara doesn't quote the entire pasuk, and what's important is that we read the first 4 words of this pasuk instead of just the last couple of words in the pasuk. And the first 4 words of the pasuk read Bizarak HaKohenes Hadam. So obviously the subject of this pasuk is Rikas Hadam. And then at the end of the pasuk, after it says Bizarak HaKohenes Hadam al Mizbeach Hashem Pesach Ol Moed, and then it says Viktir HaChelev L'Reach Nichoach L'Hashem. The Torah here in one pasuk, from the Reisha to the Seifa, connects Zrikas Adam with Haktoras HaChelev. And this is telling us that you'll have a Vizorak HaKohenes Adam if you'll have a Hiktir HaChelev Reach Nichoach Hashem. So once you have Hiktir Chelev, then Vizorak Adam Ala Mizbeach. Chelev afal pishein basar. So all the basar was tameh, but you could be makter the chelev because the chelev is still tar. And we derive from this pasuk that the dam becomes kosher lizrika as a result of the chelev. Chelev without basar. And I think, in my mind, again, the limited knowledge of kosher that I have, this is a clear-cut example of what we call achilas mizbeach. We think of the word achila in terms of achilas adam, and certainly in kosher that's true. But there's another parallel concept of achila in kosher, which is achilas mizbeach. And I'm reminiscing back to my younger years when Rav Soloveitchik used to give us before Yontif special shiurim. Usually gave one shiur before Yontif to the group. So I remember before Shavuos, he used to very often give us a little bit of kudshim, a taste of shtei alechem, and he would learn with us a Mishna and Menachos that compared the Omer to the shtei alechem. And that's where he introduced these concepts of achilas adam and achilas mizbeach. He used to talk about the fact that on Shavuos we bring the shtei alechem, which is matir chadash lachilas mizbeach. And there's a sugya in Menachos that raises the question: is there a difference? Let's say he went ahead and before they brought the shtei alechem, he took a korban mincha and he brought it on the Mizbeach. And the Gemara has two scenarios. One scenario is he brought it on the Mizbeach before the Omer was brought, before Tezayim B'Nisan. And the other is he brought the Mincha Min HaChadash after the Omer, but before Shtei Alechem. And basically what Rav Soloveitchik was developing, I remember in that shiur, in that context, was that we need to be matir achilas adam before we can be matir achilas mizbeach. And the matir achilas adam, as far as chadash is concerned, is the omer. And the matir of achilas mizbeach, as he called it, is the shtei alechem in terms of chadash. So that once we have the first matir of achilas adam, we're well on the way to be matir the achilas mizbeach. We haven't yet got to the shtei alechem. But the nafkamina is when I need two matirim, then the korban mincha is completely possible and it has to be replaced, even if b'diavad he brought that mincha min hachodesh before the shtei alechem. But if, on the other hand, he already had the first matir, so we're in that 7-week period between the omer and the shtei alechem, then in such a case, b'diavad the mincha is ksherim min hachodesh. So anyway, I'm just reminiscing back in my old days. That's when the Rav used to talk about achilas adam, achilas mizbeach, the famous principle called mimashke Yisrael min hamutar beficha, that we can only allow for achilas mizbeach in something that would be permissible for achilas adam. So the Gemara says the following: what imurim are sufficient, if they're tar, to be machshir the zrikas hadam? Ashkan Chelev, you've proven to me from this pasuk that says v'hikter Chelev that Chelev is enough to be machshir at the beginning of the pasuk v'zorak hakohen is hadam ala mizbeach. But yoseres hakoved and shtei hakloyos mino. There are other parts of the animal that are subject to haktor al gabi ha'esh. They are the broader concept of a murim. So we have aktarsi murim, and although chelev maybe is prominent because it's explicit in the pasuk, there are other parts of the murim that are also brought on the mizbeach, like the kloyos, or for example the oseres hakaved. These are parts of the biology of the animal. These are tissues that have to be brought on the mizbeach. And what happens if the chelev also contracted tumah? So there's no possibility neither of basar for achilas adam, because all that basar was tameh. There's no possibility of chelev because the chelev contracted tumah, so we can't be makter the chelev. But what we're left with in Tara is the oseres hakaved and the Kloyos, can we upgrade them to the status of Basar for Achilas Mizbeach in order to be Machshir the Zrikas Adam? So the Gemara says, Minola, if indeed a Kazayas of Kloyos or a Kazayas of Yoseres HaKaved would be sufficient to be Machshir the Zrikas Adam, you have to have a source for that. And therefore the Gemara asks, Minola, how do we know that even Yoseres HaKaved, Shtei Kloyos have the same status as Chelev in order to be Machshir the Zrikas Adam? Now, just to mention the pasuk in Chumash, so we know where we're coming from. This is in Vayikra Perek Gimel. The Torah says that Uvekeves Maktirim. Okay, it doesn't say. I don't have the whole pasuk here in front of me, but anyway, the pasuk says that we take. Maybe we'll get to it a little bit later. That we're maktir also the Kloyos and the Yoseres HaKaved. So we know that Chelev is considered basar, but now we're trying to figure out. So first the Gemara says, Heicha Amrina Desarkina. You're asking a question, Minolan, which is predicated on the assumption that indeed we will be Zorik the Dam if we still have the Kazayas of Lamazogin Yoseres HaKaved or Kloyos that retained the state of Tara. Give me a source, at least in Chazal, in the Mishna, Tosefta, that indeed that's enough to be machshir. And then we'll look for a source in the Torah. So he says, Midiktani, we have a brisa that says, Ubemincha, afal picha kula kayemis loz Yisro. A very innocuous statement of the brisa. And the brisa says that with regard to certain korbanos that are accompanied by a korban mincha, if the korban itself, all its basar, from A to Z, all contracted tumah, it's not enough that there's still a korban mincha, the shirayim of which can be eaten by zichrei kahuna, in order to be machshir the zrikas adam. So afal picha kula kayemes, you have the entire shirayim of the mincha. And this mincha is what we call a nachschlepper. It's an attendant or an accompaniment to the korban of the zevach. And you might think, therefore, the mincha is the completion of the zevach. And if we can eat the shirayim of the mincha, that's enough to be machshir the zrikas adam. Says the brisa, you should know, mincha is a separate entity. I mean, it might accompany the zevach, but it's tofel. It's not a significant part enough of the korban to justify zrikas hadam, even though the mincha is completely taught. So now the Gemara is medayek, this yes and not something else. So the Gemara says the following: mincha hu delo meaning lo yizrok. Aval Yoseres HaKaved Shtei Alecha Ushtei Kloyos Shaper Dami, meaning the Bryce is trying to tell you a chiddush that mincha is not part of the guf hakorban, and therefore will not salvage the zrika if the basar of the zevach became tamei and the mincha is still tahor. But that's again because the mincha is a separate hakrav al gabi mizbeach. It has its own kiyum to it. But anything that's part of the guf hakorban, like for example, Yoseres HaKaved and the Kloyos, that would salvage and justify the zrika. Because otherwise, the Brisa should have told me a bigger chiddush, that there are even parts of the inherent korban, of the guf hakorban, which are not significant enough, if they're tar, to justify the zrika. Don't tell me, oh, mincha is not good enough because mincha is independent. Okay, that I understand. Mincha is not part of the guf hakorban, but tell me something of a bigger chiddush about the guf hakorban. And therefore, we derive the conclusion that anything that's part of the Guf HaKorban could be enough to be Machshir the Zrikas Hadam. But now we're ready for the main question. I mean, no. Okay, you've convinced me that the Tanoim in this Brisa maintain that position, and it's enough to have these, these hashlavos of Haktaras Eimurim. As long as they're Torah, that will salvage the Korban. Where do we know it from? So the Gemara answers, Rav Yochanan Didei Omar. Now it's interesting. The Gemara answers the word Didei. Sometimes when you're dealing with the Doraisa Halach, as we are here, you want to quote a Tana, you want to quote a Mishnah, and derive a Yalfusa from some source in the Torah. But here we don't have any source in the Tanoim to explicate what is the Yalfusa, the drasha from which we derive this conclusion. Rabbi Yochanan came up with it on his own. I mean, it has to be studied, on a global level about the methodology of the Talmud. What Doraisa laws can be derived through drashos by Amoraim without any transmission and a Masorah of Tanoim. I mean, a Kavachomer, fine. Maybe a Kavachomer, not a Gzeir Shava, for example. Gzeir Shava, you can't come up with on your own. In any event, Amakra, we're back to the same pasuk that we started with. And the pasuk reads, "V'zarak hakonis adam al mizbeach Hashem al mizbach Hashem pesach al moed v'hiktir achelev," and then the pasuk adds 3 words which we didn't pay any attention to. Now we have to focus on them, and it says "L'reach nichach Hashem." Now, reach nichach is a concept that refers to anything that's burnt on the mizbeach. And the Torah went out of its way in this pasuk to add a more global rule than v'hikra achelev. It's v'hikra achelev A, or anything that's considered reach nichach Hashem. So the reach nichach Hashem is added as what seems to be redundant to be marbe, a broader circle, the scope of which includes anything that's reich nichach, anything that's burnt on the mizbeach. All shatamala l'reich nichach. So that means anything that's called imurim, which is subject haktar al gabi mizbeach, that's called reich nichach. And the Torah is telling you, v'zarak hakohen es adam. For what purpose? L'reich nichach, meaning for the haktar imurim minus the aktaras hachelev. You don't have the possibility of aktaras hachelev because in this scenario the chelev contracted tumah, but you have reach nichach with the other imurim of yoser sakaved and the kloyos. Now the Gemara is asking the following question: why did the Torah feel compelled to teach me both Chelev and Reach Nichach? Both Chelev meaning the vehiktir HaChelev, and then Reach Nichach to add even the other Emurim, that all of the above, whether it's Chelev, which is explicit in the Pasuk, whether it's the balance of the Emurim that's implicit in Reach Nichach, why did the Torah have to give me 2 categories? So the first part in one direction is quite clear. Because Rachmana Chelev, if the Torah hadn't added Reach Nichach, Havamina, Chelev in, Yoser Sakov Shteklois lo. That's obvious. Because the primary Haktara is the Chelev. Now you want to expand it to include other emurim that are defined under the general rubric, the general scope of Reach Nichach. I need a pasuk for that. That's clear. Therefore, Kasav Rachmana l'reach nichach. So we don't have any problem justifying l'reach nichach. But why don't we do the other way around? Why don't the Torah just tell me reach nichach and kal v'chomer chelev? Because of Rachmana, reach nichach hava mina shekol ha'olim l'reach nichach afilu mincha. Because of Rachmana chelev to tell me that we have to limit and clip the wings of reach nichach, meaning that in the Havamina, if the Torah had just said reach nichach without any limitation, we would have taken the most expansive definition of reach nichach. And reach nichach now becomes all-inclusive, and it includes even what we call accompaniments. I called it nachschleppers of the Korban, because in the process of bringing the Korban, we have to also bring the menachos and the nesachim, of course. But the menachos is what we're focusing on now. And we would think that the Korban mincha, which is now accompanying the Korban, that itself is enough to justify the Zrikas Hadam, to validate Zrikas, because even the Korban mincha that accompanies the Korban is included in the general all-inclusive scope of reach nichach. It's something that we will bring on the Mizbeach. Is now the Torah says Chelev. Chelev means that your reach nichach has to be an expansion of Chelev. It has to have a fundamental similarity to Chelev. And what makes it similar to Chelev? It resembles Chelev in that it's part of the Guf HaKorban. And that's going to limit the scope of reach nichach to exclude that kind of haktorah, which, although it certainly is related to the Korban, but it's not part of the Guf HaKorban. It's a separate entity. And this Rabbosai leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Ayin Tes. Now, this Mishnah is sort of a throwback to an earlier Mishnah, which we discussed about Achilas Pesachim, Tumah, and other Korbanos Tumah. And now the Mishnah wants to tell me when, under what circumstances, can we bring a Korban Pesach, and for that matter, any Korban Tzibur, Tumah. And this is all derived from Parshas Ba'aloscha. Ish kiyeh tamei lenefesh v'asa pesach Hashem. And then it says b'chodesh hasheni b'arba'asar yom ben arbayim yasu oso. And the pasuk is saying that a person is tamei, and yet he brings the korban. So that's called a Pesach haba b'tumah, and we're on the 14th of Nisan. If it's a yachid, if it's an individual, then the Torah goes ahead and says that he should be postponed until the 14th of Iyar and bring a Pesach Sheni. And if you remember the Gemara back on Daf Samach Vav Amid Beis, which was a long time ago, and the Gemara over there said that the word Ish, which opens up this parsha, in fact, it says Ish twice, Ish, that's coming to tell you that although a Tameh is given a second round and he is pushed off from the first Korban Pesach to the second Korban Pesach a month later, but nevertheless, that's because he's an Ish. He is a Yachid, but the Tzibur are not going to be delayed, are not going to be pushed off the Pesach chain. So when we get to the point in which the Tzibur are Tmeim, then we're going to bring the Korban B'tum. Now, what does that mean, that Tzibur are Tmeim? So the Mishnah says the following. One of three possible scenarios. Number one, Nitma Kahal, which means the entire community was Tameh. That might be the case that you remember we discussed where the Nasi died and everybody had to be Mitami themselves to the Nasi. Or Rubo. If most of the community, and Rashi and other Rishonim say it means those who are coming for the Korban Pesach, most of those who are coming for the Korban Pesach have contracted Tumah, then Holchim Basar Rov. So you have the Azara. and all the people who bring their Korban Pesach on the 14th are in the Azar. Maybe they're not all there at the same time, but we can calculate all those who will come. We come up with a number, and if 51% of that number are Tmeim, then the Korban is brought B'tumah. That's called Rov Kol. So you read this Mishnah as what you call Lozu Afsu. Lozu, and if Kol HaKol would come in. El Afsu, if Rov HaKol Atmeim, that's enough to justify bringing the Korban B'tumah. And we're not going to push off anyone for Pesach Sheni. And the Gemara is going to later say that even if you have 51 against 50, and that 51st is Tameh, that means one person tips the balance here and creates Rov Tzibur, Rov Kol. One person. This is what you say, count the votes. You know what I mean? One person who's Tameh can tip the scale. So, it's almost a moral message. You know, I come from a family of Darshanim. You know, Horton, here's a who, if you know what I'm talking about. So one person, that little hoof that comes from little Horton, right? That's going to tip the scale. The Mishnah tells us in Masechet Ksubis that if Nebuchadnezzar, a Jewish girl, was raped, and we're not sure if she was raped by a guy, and then she cannot marry a Kohen, or by a Jew and she can marry a Kohen, and the Gemara says we count the people in the city, and if there's one person more who's Jewish, hopefully, then she's Muteris L'Kohen. It's amazing how Rov means what it is, Rov. Now we have category number 2. O, Shahayu HaKohanim Tmeim. Rabbi said, do you notice a word that's missing? I was thinking it was a girsis. I was going to write it in, you know, as a. Which word is missing here? Read it again. It says Nitma Kol HaKol Orubo, and then it says O Shahayu HaKohanim Tmeim. It doesn't say Rubo Shel Kohen. And from this we derive the conclusion, it's not my chiddush, that if there's one Kohen who's tar, then he will bring the Korban Pesach. I mean, he's got a heck of a job on his shoulders, but he's going to be in charge of the Korban. Why? Because we're holding now Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur. And Dechuya B'tzibur means we have to turn over every leaf and every stone in order to find a way of bringing the Korban B'tara. And all we need for that. So with regard to Tzibur, there's a separate halacha that this Korban is a Korban for Tmeim. Why? Because Rov Tzibur generates a Chal Hashem Tzibur and a Tzibur of Tmeim. And therefore the Korban is brought B'tumah. But when it comes to Kohanim, it's all a matter of how to implement Akrova. We need a Kohen to implement Akrova. Do we have a Kohen Torah? Is the Kohen Torah in the audience, in the house? One Kohen in the back row says, I'm Torah. You're going to do the Akrova. And all this we derive from the absence of one word in the Mishnah, the word Rov. So I'll read to you. This is the language of the Gvuras Ari. He writes, Miloshan HaMishnah, Shalo Nokta Rov Kohanim, Muchach Shem Rov HaKohanim Tmeim, Yasu HaPesach B'tara Al Yidei Miut Kohanim HaTahorim, Kevon Shetuma Dechuya B'tzibur. So Tumah Dechuya B'tzibur means Efshal Asos B'tara. We're not going to do the Korban B'tumah because we have a Kohen. He calls it Miut Kohen, but again, for our purposes, even one single Kohen who can implement the Avodah B'tara. The Ein Adoma L'Nitma Rov HaKol Sheish Lev Din Tzibur the Ein Tzibur Nidchim B'tumah. Interesting. That with regard to Tzibur, you have a Tzibur of Tmeim, and we're not going to be Doche and reject the tzibur of Tmeim. What do you mean you have a tzibur of Tmeim? I've got a whole bunch of tahorim here. It doesn't matter. Once you have a rove, they determine the complexion of the tzibur, and it's ein hatzibur tmeim, ein tzibur tmeim nidach. And this leads us to a kash on the Rambam, which I'll leave you with. The Rambam in the 4th parak of Bias Migdash writes that after rov kanim tmeim osim b'tum. The Rambam, so to speak, interprets that the word rov goes in both directions. It's referring to the tzibur, the kol, and the liel, and also milara, and it's referring to the kohen. So if you have rov kohen and tmeim according to the Rambam, we will bring the korban b'tumah. And we're not going to ask, well, when the kohen comes up to the front, we're not going to take his temperature, ask him if he's allowed to be makriv the korban, if you follow what I mean. Let him do it b'tumah. Why? Because rov kohen and tmeim. And the Rambam would seem elsewhere to paskin that Tumah dechuya b'tzibur. If the Rambam would hold Tumah hudja b'tzibur, so you have rov kohanim tmeim, I don't have to run around and find Joe Cohen who's taught. But the Rambam holds dechuya, and if the Rambam holds dechuya, how could he then set up a din of rov kohen? And the only mathematical conclusion, we don't know where the Rambam got it from, is that there's a chal shem kohanim, just like there's a kahal of Yisrael, and you could have rov tzibur, and rov tzibur tmeim is einem nidachim. You could have a tzibur of kohanim. Again, it's very strange. I don't know. Are we going to search through the entire world and look up every kohen, out in the boondocks and say, well, are you Torah or Tumah, and then calculate the rov? Or again, it's the kohanim that enter into the azara for the purpose of being makriv the korban, like the kohanim of the base av of that particular period of time, or that day, I should say. I don't know. All these details have to be ironed out. But one thing I know is that the Rambam holds that the word rov refers to kohen. And if the rov kohanim are tmeim, then the korban will be brought b'tumah, according to the Rambam sheet. It's against everybody. So again, hoyu akodim tmeim v'akol tahorim yasu b'tumah. So Pesach haba b'tumah. Okay, now we have on the Mishnah Tosis Yontif, one of the super commentaries on the Mishnah. And he says the following. Ve'elu ha'ofanim yesh lehem din tzibur sha'osim Pesach Rishon b'tumah. We now have a din of tzibur as far as the law of Pesach Rishon b'tumah. V'afal gav dikshenitmu hakohanim v'akol tahorim. So how can we set up a tzibur of tmeim when the tzibur are tahorim? He says hareza nidon kitzibur tmeim. Because of the Tumas Kohanim, the tzibur are considered a tzibur of tmeim. V'eina tzibur nidche lePesach Sheni. And Tosis Yontif wants to suggest that perhaps we could classify this case of Tumas Kohanim as Tumas HaKorban Atzmo. Meaning, what difference it make if the kohol, the tzibur, the balei HaKorban Tmeim, or if the korban itself is Tumah? He says that's wrong. The ofen zeh, in the case of Tumas Kohanim, HaPesach Yovo b'tumah b'nei Tumas Kohanim, mipnei she'iyaf shal lahakriv biltei hakravosam, V'tumas hakohanim, which he says becomes a korban that has to be brought b'tumah, lo mishum negiosam b'basar. Don't think that because the kohanim are tmeim, therefore the korban itself is tummy because the kohen has direct contact with the basar. No, 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 no. Halo yecholim hakohanim lizar shelo lagas b'basar. Obviously, the kohanim have to come into contact with the kelim, like for example, the mizrach that receives the dam, or the sakin for shchita. But as far as the basar, not necessary. Yechol lizar shelo lagas b'basar. But rather he says, since the hakrava is being done b'tumah, the zrika, the aktaris habasar, again, it could be, when we say it's done b'tumah, it's because the kohanim are tmeim. The kohanim set up a hakrava b'tumah. It's a kohen tamei who's doing the zrika sadam. It's the kohen tamei who's doing the aktaris imurim. That means it's a korban that's being brought b'tumah because the hakrava is b'tumah, not because the basar is tamei. Now, let me ask you the obvious question. And the answer, I think, is posh. What happens if rov hakol are tahorim, but rov or kol hakohanim, depending on that one, atmein? The answer is posh. That's a korban haba b'tumah. So that the tumas kohanim, in and of itself, independent of the tzibur and their status, the tzibur are tahorim because rov are tahorim. But the hakrava of the kohanim is going to be kohanim b'tumah because the kohanim are tmeim. That in and of itself would set up a korban haba b'tumah. V'chein, im hakohanim tmeim v'kohol tahorim, or yesh rak miut b'kol tmeim, einam nidachim l'pesach sheni, otzim es ha'pesach harishon im hatahorim. And now we have to ask the following question. You're bringing this korban b'tumah because of the kohen. And the kol, the Yisrael, are tahorim. Well, what about those miut Yisraelim who are tmeim? Can they jump on the bandwagon and participate in the Korban Pesach and be yotze through Pesach Rishon haba b'tumah and even eat the basar b'tumah? I mean, that's halach in Rov Tzibur. Here the Rov Tzibur are tahorim. And he says the following. Again, I find this very revolutionary. He says that Gama Tahorim Otzim is a Pesach B'tumah. You think you're a big shot, right? You're a member of the Kol and you're Tahor. So for you, this is a korban B'tara. Those mutes, those few individuals, the silent minority who are Tmeim, that's their problem. They can't participate in this korban because this is a korban haba b'tara. We are tahorim and we represent rov hatzibur. No, this is a korban haba b'tumah, and even the tahorim are able to fulfill their mitzvah of korban pesach because this is a korban haba b'tumah. Once we classify this korban and we allow the korban to go full steam ahead, because the kohanim are tmeim, that's called a korban haba b'tumah. Even the taharim are participating, only riding on the shoulders of the tmeim, meaning that they can participate because the kohanim are tmeim, and that makes the korban into a korban haba b'tumah. Once the korban haba b'tumah, there's no difference between the members of the kol, who represent the rov, who are taharim, and the minority who are tmeim. We're all in the same boat because it's a korban haba b'tumah. Now here, the going gets a little bit tough. What happens in the following scenario? Right now, the kohanim are tahorim, and the tzibur, the kol, divides up into two groups, the majority of which are tahorim. The tahorim started bringing the korban, as they should, and the akrava was a regular, classic akrava v'tara. Now the kohanim became tmei. What happens now to the miut kol tmeim? We said that the miut kol tmeim ride on the shoulders of the tahorim, because even the tahorim are dipping into a korban haba b'tumah. But that makes sense if the kohanim were tmeim before the hakrava began. But if the kohanim at this point are not tmeim, and the process of hakrava is well on the way, and 1,000 Yisraelim tahorim have brought their korban b'tara, and now the kohanim contracted tumah. Now we want to shift from a korban pesach sheba b'tara to one that's ba b'tumah. Can the tmeim now, how should I say, hook in and connect to this korban haba b'tumah when the tahorim started the process of hakrova, and that was a complete hakrova for the tahorim? And at that point, the kohanim were tahorim as well, so it was hakrova b'torah. How did the tmeim, it representing the minority, link up to this korban, which was a korban haba b'tara? And the answer is, they can still link up. Why? Because once the kohanim contracted tumah, whether it's all the kohanim or Rambam has most of the kohanim, now we shift into a new mode, and now we start a hakrava haba b'tumah. And once hakrava haba b'tumah, then anyone, whether you're tar or tameh, you can join in to that korban. So it means that the hakrava is not determined and fixed in stone in its own moment, such a way that it will determine the nature of the hemshech hakrava, but every single stage and every single segment of the hakrava is a separate unit, and it's nidon al piatz. And if at some point in the hakrava process, the kohanim all contracted tumah, let's say chas v'sholom, the kohen gadol died, and all the kohanim unanimously, from one to the first to the last, they all participated in the levaya, and they became tameh. Now we begin a new process of a hakravas hapesach b'tumah, and everyone who is chayav in the mitzvah of korban pesach will link up to that hakrava. Fine. Okay, so that we read already. Now I want to present to you a chiddush of the Chazon Ish. Nitma hakol, which means that the korban is ba b'tumah and it's nechal b'tumah. We will eat the korban b'tumah. Rov kohanim tahorim. Who is going to be makriv this korban? I don't think we discussed this. We have rov kohanim tahorim, but we have miut kohanim tmeim. Rov kol tmeim. Who is going to be the lucky kohen to be makriv the korban Pesach? We have a rule called Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur. And we got plenty of kohanim tahorim around. Most of the kohanim are still tahor. Are you going to give the hakrava to a kohen tameh? That makes no sense. Says the Chazon Ish, the kohen tameh can do the hakrava. Af sherov hakohanim tahorim nase haPesach al afilu al yedei kohanim atmein. Not only that, if we have klei shares, some of which are tahorim, most of them are tahorim, and some of which are tmeim, we're talking about the sakin for shchita or the mizrak for kabbalas hadam, is mutal akachas klei shares tmeim, afal gav diyesh tahorim. What's going on? Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur. If Tumah is D'chuya B'tzibur, it means we push the envelope and we do all our maximum efforts to do whatever we can with Tahara. No, says the Chazon Ish. Forget it. And here's the lumdus. He says, Me'achar, since it was Rov Tzibur B'tumah, Hutra HaTumah B'davar Echad, Umemela Hutra Af L'shar Dvar. Amazing. We're holding Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur. But at one point, we switch our mode of thinking to Tumah Hutra B'tzibur. Why? Because even in D'chuya, there's a heter to be makriv the korban b'tumah. Once that heter is chal, now it's matir everything b'tumah. So we're not going to have a situation where, okay, we're bringing the korban b'tumah, but let's be as careful as we can. Find the kohanim tahorim to do the avoda. Find the klisharis hatahorim. No. Once it becomes, as a result of rov tzibur, a korban haba b'tumah, now there's a heter. And the heter says you have a green light, go ahead and bring the korban b'tumah. When you bring the korban b'tumah, we're not going to differentiate between the bailim, between the kohanim, between the klei shares. Everything can be done b'tumah because the heter is already come. I find this absolutely fascinating because it shows you that tumah D'chuya B'tzibur is not exactly what we think it means. Okay. Now, the Mishnah mentions Korban Pesach. However, this din in the Mishnah applies to any Korban Tzibur because Tumah D'chuya B'tzibur applies to any Korban Tzibur, lav dafka Korban Pesach. If nitma kol hakol or rubo or nitma kohanim, nitma miut hakol is eino dochen. Now he quotes the Gvuras Ari. Gvuras Ari b'shar korbanos tzibur milvad Pesach tumas hakol eino sibo lahakriv b'tumah ela tumas hakohanim hamakrivin. I don't get it. He's saying here that I only mentioned to you because it's such a fundamental point that I have to understand it. I don't understand it, but it's so fundamental, I can't. He says that with regard to a korban tzibur, forget about Pesach. The halacha of Tumah b'tzibur, of bringing the korban b'tzibur, is halacha b'shar korban tzibur milvad Pesach. Tumas hakol is not. You know what I think he's saying? This is wild. Again, this from anything I tell you now is Berzon. Don't blame it on the Gvurus I read. But I think what he's saying is that there are two concepts of tzibur. And when we talk about a korban tzibur, it's not miksha achas. You can have a korban tzibur in which no one's obligated. The tzibur is obligated. Qua tzibur. You could have a korban tzibur where every single individual in the tzibur is obligated. And herein lies the difference between korban Pesach and a korban tzibur. We can classify a korban Pesach as a korban tzibur, but we're fooling ourselves. It's a bluff. It's achizas einayim. It's not really a korban tzibur, because in a korban tzibur, no one's chayiv in the tzibur. The tzibur is chayiv in the korban. So I could talk to you, John, and I could talk to you, Jeff and Steve, and I could talk to you, Dr. Wolf, and I could talk to Rabbi Kapustin, and I could tell each and every one of you, you're chayiv in the korban tumah. That's totally wrong. With all due respect, you're not chayiv in the korban tumah. So who's chayiv in the korban tumah? The tzibur is chayiv in the korban tumah. Not so in the case of korban Pesach. Let's not fool ourselves. I can address every one of you and myself, and you are chayiv in the korban Pesach. We bring the korban Pesach as a tzibur in the sense that everyone is on board because we all have the shared obligation, as opposed to any other korban on the face of the, the constellations. But at the end of the day, you can't say, well, I'm not chayiv. The tzibur is chayiv. No. You're chayiv kares if you don't bring the korban Pesach, my friend. Not so in the Talmud. I went to Florida and I took a vacation and I'm not interested in the korban Talmud. Don't bother me. Let someone else take care of it. I'm not responsible. And then nafkamina is rov. Where does it make sense to start counting individuals until you get to number 51 and you have a rov? That makes sense in korban Pesach. It makes no sense in a korban tzibur. What are you going to tell me? Rov hatzibur tmeim, and therefore we're going to bring a korban tamid b'tumah? That concept is it just makes no sense. You can't talk about rov tzibur when the individual has no chiyuv. You're counting 1, 2, 3 until you get to the rov. Who are you counting? You counting Yankel Beryl, who took a flight to sunny Florida? He's not chayiv in the korban tamid. In Pesach, the tzibur is a sach hakol, an amalgamation, a counting of all the individuals, because each individual is chayiv in Pesach. Now you can talk. It makes sense to talk about rov. So the Gvurus Hari says that with regard to other korbanos tzibur, don't believe for one moment that the opening line in the Mishnah is applicable, nitma hakol aruba, because a korban tzibur is brought b'tumah because the kohanim are tmeim. O shahayu kohanim tmeim. Herein lies the overlap between any korban tzibur and korban pesach, and therefore the Shagasari doesn't understand all these Rishonim who say that our Mishnah applies to a Korban Tzibur just as well as to a Korban Pesach. In his understanding, there's a fundamental difference between the two. Korban Haba B'Tumah means, in the case of Pesach, it means Rov HaTzibur, Rov HaKol. But in the case of other Korbanos, it means the Kohanim Atzmei, whether it's Rov or Kulam, whatever it might be. Kach ani evan. Okay. Nitma, the Mishnah continues, Miut Kahal, only a minority are Tmeim of the call, is HaTahorim Osim Es Pesach Rishon, VaTmeim Osim Pesach Sheni. So the case of Ish, who is pushed off to Pesach Sheni, that's the case where the minority of the call are Tmeim, the Kohanim are Tahorim, the Klei Sharis are Tahorim, most of the call are Tahorim, and Nebuch the Tmeim, or B'derech Rechoka, we'll see later on, that's going to be a major subject in this parak, they will bring Korban Sheni, Pesach Sheni. So again, we're running out of time, but just to start the Gemara, Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brisa, Areisha Hayu Yisrael Tameim, the Kohanim Uklei Shares Tahorim. So this is a case of Pesach Haba B'Tumah, because the Kol are Tameim, that's number one. Oh, here's scenario number two. Yisrael Tahorim, Kohanim Uklei Shares Tameim. We have now Kohanim Tmeim, and in this case also the Klei Sharis Tmeim. Again, according to the Rambam, it means Rov Kohanim Tmeim. According to all other Rishonim, it means Kol Kohanim Tmeim. Now we have category or scenario number three. Afilu Yisrael v'Kohanim Tahor. We could still have a Pesach Haba B'Tumah because the Klei Sharis Tmeim. Now this is a Pella. What do you mean the Klei Sharis Tmeim? Can't you just take them to the mikvah? But the answer is you need Harev Shemesh, even in the case of Kelim Tmeim. And therefore the status of a Kli that contracted Tumah is equal to what we call a Tvul Yom, and it cannot be used in the Mikdash. But now we have a situation where all the Kelim are Tmeim. Is Yasu B'Tumah. She'ein Korban Tzibur Cholok. And we're not going to make any difference in the actual hakrava. It's going to be exactly the same hakrava as would be if it wasn't Ba B'Tumah. And he says that Ein Korban Tzibur Ba B'Tumah Cholok B'Maseu Beina Makrivim Chelkom Yasu B'Tumah v'Chelkom B'Tara Elikevan Shekorban Hu Rov HaTzibur B'Tumah is Af HaYechidim Yasu B'Tumah. Once the Korban, based on the Rov, becomes a Korban B'Tumah, and there's no difference between the Rov and the Miyad, between the Tahorim and the Tmeim. Everybody is going to bring and participate in this Korban Haba B'Tumah. Okay, then Rabbosai, this is where we're going to stop, and Amir Hashem, B'li Neder, will pick it up tomorrow. And I find this one of the most intriguing sugyas here about Pesach Haba B'Tumah. Okay, then, everyone should have a great day. Let me just add one thing before we close the shir. He makes a comment here that the sakin for shchita is called kli sharis. That we have to keep in mind. And he says the following: Nitmu rov kohanim ukli sharis hanitzrochim lasias pischei Yisrael v'chein b'ofen harishon all Yisrael tmeim is rov Yisrael. So this is a chiddush here, quoted in the name of Zevach Teva, of the Zevach Toda. So B'li Neder, this is where we're going to make a note that we got up to, and we'll pick this up pick this up tomorrow. Okay. All right. Now, what happens here with this Zoom business here? I don't know. What are they telling me?